Alright guys, to go along with the video I made of the Timpani Etude, I thought I'd share some helpful tips and tricks for playing it. I'll discuss some of the trouble spots and various other places in the Etude that will hopefully shed some light on how to play it as best as you can. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what kind of mallets to use. There's a wide range of timpani mallets, from really hard staccato mallets to really soft ones and everywhere in between. For this Etude, you have a pretty good mix of articulate passages and rolls, so I would recommend going with a middle ground mallet, like a general timpani mallet. Just the middle ground general timpani mallet will be really good. It'll be articulative enough for the 16-note passages you have in this Etude, but also soft enough for the rolls. The next thing to think about is sticking. For timpani, we don't generally follow a strict sticking policy like we do for snare drum. Usually for timpani, it's recommended to just alternate your hands most of the time. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions to that rule where you have to double a hand, but most of the time, aim to alternate your sticking. Looking at this opening adagio section, they don't give you a starting dynamic, but I'd suggest starting out pretty strong. Maybe go with a forte, mezzo forte, something so that you have somewhere to decrescendo to, with that decrescendo in the first measure down to mezzo piano. When I played it, I started out a forte, I'd say. I think that's a pretty good starting dynamic. In measure 4, you have that forte piano crescendo roll. Obviously, if you've made it this far in the audition process, you've already demonstrated that you know how to play a forte piano crescendo roll on the timpani. But just in case, for forte piano crescendo rolls, you want to make sure that your first couple of hits are loud. Some people go with a school of thought of like just one single forte hit and then the rest are piano after that. But I think it sounds a lot better to have maybe the first 2 or even 3 hits pretty strong, and then you drop down to as quietly as you possibly can play, and then you build it back up to as loud as you can play. So again, just make sure your first couple of strokes are nice and strong. I think that gives it a fuller sound at the beginning of your roll with 2 or 3 strong strokes rather than just 1. Drop it down to as quietly as you can possibly play, and then gradually build it back up to your loudest dynamic. You want to make sure that your final stroke should be nice and strong. Don't lose momentum on that crescendo. Moving on to the Allegro section, we obviously have an increase in speed from 76 to 120. They also give you a starting dynamic for this section of mezzo forte, so be sure you start somewhat strong, but not too loud. I talked a second ago about sticking policies for timpani and how we don't really have a set sticking policy other than try to alternate as much as possible. However, in measure 6, we have an example of an exception to that rule. In measure 6, I'd recommend following the straight sticking policy, the same one that we use when playing snare, which is use your right hand for notes that fall on the beat and on the and left hand for the e's and the uhs. I even wrote the sticking in for you in measure 6, so you can see how that will work. But that sticking will work really well for that measure and set you up for the following measure as well, where you'll also follow straight sticking. In measure 7, you also have that half note roll that starts on beat 3. Definitely be sure to decrescendo that as marked, but don't decrescendo too far. You want to leave room for the decrescendo that happens in measure 8 that then takes you all the way down to a piano level. So again, decrescendo that roll, but not too much. Maybe from a mezzo forte to about a mezzo piano. As you decrescendo to your softest dynamic in measure 8, go ahead and move closer to the rim for a softer effect. Just like when we play snare and we move closer to the rim for the piano sections, you can do that on timpani as well. I've included a diagram here that kind of shows the playing area that you can aim for. The spots that I colored in red are the rim areas that you want to aim for. Now don't play on the rim. You just want to get close to it, and that'll help you to play even softer than if you play in the normal playing area. In measures 10 and 11, you've got triplets. Sticking for triplets can get a little funky sometimes, but in this passage, I'd recommend just alternating your hands. See the sticking that I wrote in for measure 11. That'll set you up perfectly for that roll that you have in measure 12. Now don't forget to build into measure 12 with the crescendo underneath those triplets. You'll build into that roll, and there's even an accent on the roll, but then you'll immediately start bringing your roll back down with that decrescendo. You'll bring it down to that mezzo piano level for measure 13. Watch out for that accent in measure 13. It can sneak up on you. Now in this measure 13, there are a lot of sticking options that you can go with. Go ahead and experiment and figure out one that works best for you. But whatever you decide on, I would recommend ending on your left hand so that you can smoothly get to the higher drum in measure 14. For that 16th note passage in measure 14, be sure to alternate your sticking there. That's going to work best. And careful not to crescendo there. When you have faster passages like that, it's easy to sort of build it unintentionally, but that whole measure is still mezzo piano. You have to save your loud dynamic for the next measure. In measure 15, you're going to be suddenly forte on the and of beat 1 there. Be careful not to make beat 1 loud on the high drum. As hard as it may be, you have to resist that urge. Keep beat 1 mezzo piano, and then save your loud forte with accents for the and on your lower drum. Then you're going to decrescendo back down again into measure 16. Now in measure 16, notice that 8th rest. As you know, timpani will ring for forever if you don't mute them. So to observe a rest, you have to make sure you mute the drums. To do this, after you hit that B flat on the end of 2, you're going to take both hands and hit both of the drums at the same time. You have to make sure that you're muting quietly so that when you are putting your hands on the drum, that doesn't actually make an audible sound. It can be tricky muting the timpani, but you definitely want to get that muting in there during that 8th rest so that you can observe the rest. The muting has to be on both drums too. If you only get one of the drums, like just the B flat, and you don't mute the E flat, that E flat is just going to keep ringing, and then you still didn't observe the rest. So be sure you're muting both drums during that rest. So measure 17, you're still at a softer dynamic from that decrescendo that you had in measure 15, but then you've got that little short crescendo there at the end of 17 to build into measure 18, and then your last measure, measure 18, is forte, nice and strong, so make sure you end on a nice strong note there. I think that about covers everything, but in your practice, if you come up with a question or need help with anything, feel free to drop a comment below or reach out to me through my website. The web address is in the description below the video. You can find my contact information there and reach out with any questions you have. Happy practicing and good luck with your audition.